Big cities used to mean opportunity not as a vague aspiration or a marketing slogan, but as a concrete, almost mechanical reality embedded into how American life was structured, where proximity determined access, visibility determined relevance, and physical presence often dictated whether doors opened or remained permanently closed. Opportunity meant being close to where decisions were made, close to where industries clustered, close to where money, power, and ambition compressed themselves into dense geographic nodes. And if you wanted more of anything, more income, more influence, more momentum, more validation, you went to the city because that was where the signal was strongest. Cities weren't just locations in this sense. They functioned as instructions that quietly, but persistently told people what success should look like, how fast they should move, how much of themselves they should sacrifice, what kind of discomfort was acceptable, and what kind of life counted as serious enough to justify the struggle. They shaped not only careers, but identities, training people to equate exhaustion with progress, busyness with importance, and density with meaning. And for a very long time, people followed those instructions almost automatically because the rewards, while delayed, were tangible enough to justify the cost. For decades, the city promised that if you endured enough small apartments, long commutes, constant noise, social competition, financial strain, you would eventually arrive at something better, something larger. Something that made all the sacrifice feel intentional rather than accidental. That promise became so normalized that questioning it felt almost irresponsible, as if opting out meant you lacked ambition or resilience, and as a result, entire generations organized their lives around the assumption that struggle was not just inevitable but necessary. People still do this to some extent, but for a growing number of Americans, big cities now also mean something else entirely. Something that sits quietly alongside opportunity and slowly reshapes how it's experienced. They mean pressure that never fully lifts, exhaustion that accumulates rather than resolves, and a constant low-grade anxiety that persists even on good days. The kind that tells you no matter how hard you're working, you are always slightly behind. Behind on rest, behind on savings, behind on relationships, behind on health. Behind on the sense that life is moving forward rather than merely being managed. And what makes this realization so unsettling is how quietly it arrives. People don't wake up one morning and decide they hate cities, or suddenly reject everything they once wanted. And in fact, many still genuinely love parts of city life: the food, the culture, the diversity, the creative energy, the feeling that something interesting could happen at any moment if you're paying attention. But alongside that affection, something heavier begins to grow. A subtle sense that the effort required just to maintain a baseline version of life keeps increasing, while the rewards feel increasingly abstract, deferred, or conditional. For a long time, this feeling was treated as normal, even virtuous. Because if you lived in a big city and didn't feel stretched thin, weren't slightly overwhelmed, weren't constantly juggling time, money, and obligations, it suggested you weren't pushing hard enough. Struggle was framed as the admission price, and questioning that price meant questioning the entire logic of the city itself. What has changed is not a sudden collapse or a dramatic reversal, but a slow erosion of belief, and that erosion has altered behavior in ways that are easy to miss, because they don't announce themselves loudly. People aren't posting dramatic goodbye messages or writing long essays explaining why they're leaving, and they're not throwing farewell parties or publicly closing chapters in a symbolic way. They're just leaving quietly, without spectacle or declarations, through leases that don't get renewed, jobs that remain the same while addresses change, moving trucks that arrive on weekday mornings and disappear by afternoon. Over the last several years, something subtle but deeply consequential has been unfolding across the United States. And it doesn't look like collapse, because the cities are still alive, restaurants are still full, subways are still crowded, and offices are still reopening in partial, fragmented ways. On the surface, things appear functional, even normal, which is precisely why the deeper shift is so easy to overlook. Beneath that surface, the story has changed, because the big city is no longer the automatic next step, no longer the default container for ambition, no longer the assumed answer to questions like where you go after college or where you move to build a serious career. Instead, the city has become a question rather than a conclusion, and that question is deceptively simple but emotionally loaded. Is this still worth it? A generation ago, asking that would have sounded almost unthinkable. Because for decades, cities sold a powerful and almost mythic promise that shaped how people understood success itself. If you moved there, you were closer to everything that mattered: better jobs, Higher pay, influential people, creative energy, cultural relevancy, and simply being there signaled that you were serious about your future. Cities weren't just economic hubs. They functioned as social proof, broadcasting that you were willing to endure discomfort now for payoff later, and that you understood the rules of the game well enough to play it. Those rules were clear and widely accepted. You accept a small apartment, tolerate long commutes, live with noise and crowds and stress, sacrifice space and quiet and sometimes health, because this is temporary and therefore justified. Belief in temporariness was essential, because it allowed people to endure conditions they wouldn't otherwise tolerate, telling themselves they were in a phase-a-grind phase, a proving phase, a chapter that would eventually close once they made it. You struggle now, so you can relax later. You sacrifice now, so you can enjoy life later. And that logic didn't just influence decisions, but actively shaped identities. Entire lives were organized around it, with people moving across the country with little more than a suitcase and a vague sense of destiny, sharing apartments with strangers well into adulthood, skipping vacations, postponing rest, and working late nights and early mornings, while convincing themselves that every sacrifice was an investment. For a long time, that logic worked, because cities genuinely did offer disproportionate opportunity, and physical presence truly mattered in ways that are difficult to fully remember now. Careers were built on hallway conversations, chance meetings, and face-to-face visibility. And geography wasn't just relevant, but decisive. But slowly, and almost imperceptibly, the equation began to change as rent kept rising. Wages lagged behind, commutes grew longer, competition intensified, and what once felt like a temporary hardship began to feel permanent. People looked up one day and realized something deeply uncomfortable. The sacrifice never stopped, the later never arrived, and what was supposed to be a stepping stone had quietly become the entire path. They were earning more on paper, but saving less in reality, working harder but feeling less secure, doing everything they were told to do and still feeling as though the sense of arrival remained permanently out of reach. At some point, the internal dialogue shifts, and people stop asking how to climb higher, or obsessing over the next promotion, and instead begin asking a quieter, heavier question that doesn't demand immediate action, but refuses to go away. Why does everything feel so heavy? Why does life require constant effort just to stay in place? That question sits in the background during late-night budgeting sessions, during crowded commutes, during moments of exhaustion that feel disproportionate to the day that caused them. And it is in those moments that people begin to quietly reconsider the city itself. Housing is almost always the first pressure point, because in many major cities rent has reached levels that feel increasingly disconnected from lived reality, not because people are demanding luxury, but because the baseline cost of existing has climbed to extraordinary heights. People aren't paying for spacious homes or premium comfort. They're paying for access to jobs, access to industries, access to relevance, and what they receive in return often feels like a compromise stretched thin. A bedroom that doubles as an office, and sometimes a dining room. A kitchen with barely enough counter space to function. A living room you can't really live in. Thin walls that eliminate privacy, and noise that never fully stops. What's most destabilizing isn't just the lack of space, but the lack of progression. Because the starter apartment doesn't lead to a better one. The upgrade never materializes, and the promised improvement keeps getting postponed. Instead, each year brings the same email announcing a rent increase, sometimes small, sometimes brutal, always non-negotiable. And over time, people begin to notice something unsettling. They're paying more every year for less control over their lives. Then comes the comparison, which almost never starts as a dramatic rebellion, but instead arrives casually, through a link someone sends. A friend who moves away, a weekend trip that feels unexpectedly spacious, or a moment of idle curiosity that opens a real estate listing in a different place. At first it feels harmless, even hypothetical, but the contrast becomes impossible to ignore once it's seen clearly, because suddenly the same amount of money buys an extra room, a separate office, a backyard storage space, natural light, and something that is far harder to quantify, but immediately felt: quiet. Not luxury, not extravagance, not excess, just basic functionality that allows life to unfold without friction. And that realization often triggers a moment people struggle to describe accurately. It isn't rage or bitterness or jealousy, but something calmer and more a kind of clarity that exposes how much discomfort has been normalized simply because it was framed as the cost of ambition. People begin to recognize that they've been shrinking their expectations of daily life in order to remain loyal to a promise that no longer delivers what it once did. And once that realization takes hold, it becomes extremely difficult to unsee. Still, many people stayed for years, even after that clarity arrived, because until very recently there was always one argument strong enough to override every doubt. Work. Jobs were tied to place. Careers were built on presence. Opportunity was geographically concentrated, and the city retained its power, not because it was always pleasant, but because it was necessary. Then remote work arrived, not as a revolutionary announcement, but as a practical adjustment. And in doing so, it quietly ruptured an assumption that had structured modern life for generations. For decades, cities held a monopoly on opportunity, not because they were inherently superior environments, but because work demanded physical proximity, because your job decided your address, and because geography dictated lifestyle. Work was a place you went, and life organized itself around that fact. Remote work severed that assumption almost overnight, and suddenly millions of people realized something that felt both liberating and unsettling at the same time. Their job didn't actually live in a building. It lived on a screen. Once that truth settled in, a new question emerged that refused to stay theoretical. If I don't need to be here, why am I here? At first, many people dismissed the question, assuming remote work was temporary, an anomaly that would eventually resolve back into the old structure. And others tested the idea cautiously by moving just for a year or relocating temporarily, while keeping one foot emotionally anchored to the city. But once people experienced a different way of living, something shifted permanently. Because remote work didn't just enable people to leave cities. It gave them permission to question priorities they had never felt authorized to examine, permission to choose space over status, time over proximity, health over hustle, and presence over performance. For many, this felt like reclaiming parts of life they hadn't realized they were slowly losing. Time, in particular, became impossible to ignore, because cities take time in ways that are difficult to see clearly when you inside them, not through one dramatic loss, but through thousands of small extractions that accumulate quietly. Commuting, waiting, navigating crowds, planning around traffic, recovering from noise, preparing to leave the house, and mentally bracing for constant stimulation all siphon hours and energy that rarely get counted honestly. Day to day it feels manageable, even normal, but year to year it erodes life in ways that are only visible in hindsight. People who leave cities often say the same thing almost verbatim, regardless of where they move or why. I didn't realize how tired I was until I wasn't anymore. They wake up without rushing, cook without stress, step outside without noise, pressing in from every direction. And while none of this feels glamorous or aspirational, it feels deeply human. Once people experience that difference, it becomes difficult to ignore how much effort the city quietly demanded simply to exist within it. What many don't realize until they leave is how much mental energy urban living consumes. Not in obvious ways that announce themselves as stress, but as a constant background hum, a low-level alertness that never fully turns off. Sirens in the distance, crowds pressing too close, tight sidewalks, loud neighbors, limited privacy, and subtle but persistent feeling of always being observed and always navigating around others. For some people, this energy feels like fuel, sharpening them and making them feel connected to something larger. But for others, especially over time, it becomes exhausting in ways that are hard to articulate. Living in a constant state of awareness taxes the nervous system, preventing full rest even during moments meant to be so walks, meals, and evenings that should recharge instead remain layered with stimulation. Humans adapt well, and many people normalize this state so completely that they stop questioning it, telling themselves this is simply what adult life feels like until they experience something different. For many who leave cities, the most surprising change isn't financial or logistical, but internal, marked by the absence of noise, the absence of urgency, and the absence of constant interruption. They describe feeling calmer without knowing exactly why, sleeping better, thinking more clearly, and feeling less reactive, defensive, and rushed. Not because life becomes easy, but because life becomes quieter. Once that quiet exists, its previous absence becomes impossible to ignore. This shift often coincides with another powerful force: life stage. Cities reward flexibility, spontaneity, and tolerance for chaos. Working best when schedules are fluid, responsibilities are minimal, and the body absorbs stress without immediate consequence. That's why cities can feel magical in certain chapters of life, particularly when you're young, exploring identity, meeting new people constantly, and still deciding who you want to become. They offer infinite options, stimulation, and paths forward, but people don't stay in that stage forever. Careers stabilize, relationships deepen, families form, parents age, bodies change, and suddenly different things begin to matter in ways that can't be ignored. Space becomes a requirement rather than a luxury. Privacy becomes valuable. Quiet becomes restorative instead of boring, and routine becomes grounding rather than limiting. The city that once felt alive can begin to feel restrictive, where energy turns into noise, convenience into congestion, and possibility into friction. This doesn't mean the city failed, only that the person changed. Yet for a long time, people tried to force themselves to fit anyway, downsizing expectations, reframing exhaustion as ambition, and treating burnout as a personal flaw rather than a structural outcome. Leaving felt like quitting, because cities had positioned themselves not just as places, but as proof of seriousness, subtly framing departure as settling or choosing comfort over growth. That narrative ran deep, which is why the shift happening now is so significant, because it isn't driven by rebellion, but by reassessment. Another major pressure point in this reassessment is what many people quietly think of as the city premium, the invisible surcharge, attached to urban life that shows up everywhere once you start looking closely. An idea: rent, higher taxes, higher prices for food, services, childcare, transportation, and even basic convenience. For years, people accepted that premium because cities genuinely offered more in return: more opportunity, more cultural density, more social momentum, more chances to collide with ideas and people that could alter the trajectory of a life. But when offices went remote, nightlife slowed, social circles dispersed, and daily life became more isolated despite physical proximity, many people realized something deeply uncomfortable. They were still paying the premium, but the benefits that once justified it had thinned or disappeared entirely. Restaurants were still expensive, apartments were still small, streets were still crowded, and stress was still constant. But the upside that made all of it feel purposeful was no longer reliably present. The math stopped making sense, and once that realization arrived, people didn't panic or revolt. Some made small adjustments rather than dramatic exits, moving just outside city limits where they could still visit easily, but breathe more freely, trading walkability for space, accepting a longer drive in exchange for quiet and control. Others chose mid-sized cities, places that offered airports, culture, restaurants, and professional opportunity without the relentless pressure. Places that delivered something many people didn't realize they were craving until they found it: balance. Enough activity to feel engaged, enough space to feel grounded, enough quiet to recover without feeling disconnected from the world. And then there were those who went further, choosing small towns, mountain regions, coastal communities, and nature-first living, places where time moves differently, schedules loosen, and community feels tangible rather than transactional. Remote work made these moves possible, but desire is what made them permanent. Still, it's important to be honest about the trade-offs, because leaving a city is not a universal upgrade or a flawless solution. Leaving often means walking away from a carefully built social ecosystem, from friendships formed over years, colleagues who doubled as community, spontaneous plans, and the comfort of deep familiarity. Starting over is hard, and in smaller places social circles are often established long before you arrive, meaning community exists but isn't always immediately accessible. Loneliness can surprise people who expected peace but found silence instead. Career trajectories can shift as well, because some industries simply don't exist outside major cities. Networking becomes harder, and professional visibility decreases in subtle but meaningful ways. Remote work can flatten growth. Fewer promotions, fewer chance encounters, fewer moments where opportunity emerges unexpectedly. And some people find themselves loving the lifestyle while quietly feeling professionally stalled. There is also culture shock, expressed through different values, different norms, different expectations. Fewer events, fewer options, less diversity in some areas, greater reliance on cars, and more planning required for even simple activities. Lower housing costs, don't automatically equal a cheaper life either, because travel becomes more expensive. Access to specialized healthcare can be limited, and convenience decreases in ways that aren't always obvious at first. This is why some people return to cities. And that return matters, because it reveals the truth of what's happening. This movement is not linear, ideological, or permanent. It's experimentation. People are testing different versions of life, sometimes more than once, leaving and returning, splitting time or staying put, while renegotiating how deeply they engage with the city itself. So are big cities dying? No. Cities are resilient, adaptive systems that continue to attract people who thrive on density, ambition, creativity, and scale, and for certain careers, personalities, and stages of life, they remain unmatched. What has changed isn't the city itself, but the assumption that it is the only valid container for ambition and success. For the first time in modern history, big cities no longer have exclusive control over opportunity. Success no longer lives in one place. Ambition no longer requires a single zip code, and careers are no longer bound to a skyline. People no longer have to choose between professional growth and quality of life in the same way they once did. The city is now one option rather than the default option, and that shift is profound. Americans aren't leaving cities because they hate them, but because the cost-benefit calculation changed, because the lifestyle stopped matching the promise, and because they began redefining what success actually means. Success isn't just income anymore. It's time, space, health, and the ability to feel present in your own life. It's waking up without dread, ending the day with energy left, and having room, both physically and mentally, to breathe. Some people will always choose the city, others won't, and neither choice represents failure or retreat. What matters is that the choice now exists. The real story isn't about migration statistics or real estate trends, but about autonomy, about people realizing that life doesn't have to feel like constant pressure, that ambition doesn't require suffering, and that productivity doesn't have to mean burnout. It's about questioning scripts written decades ago for a world where opportunity was scarce, centralized, and physical. That world no longer fully exists, and once people recognize that, it becomes difficult to continue living by rules that no longer serve them. So the question isn't whether big cities are still worth it. The question is quieter and more personal. If you weren't following a script handed down by culture, if you weren't chasing an outdated definition of success, if you weren't optimizing your life for appearances rather than experience, where would you choose to live? And more importantly, how would you choose to live?